Guys good? That's actually not bad at all. Actually kind of fun. That was so much fun, we're going to do some more. Then I'll talk about how this thing actually works. 3-round magazine. Going hot. Hi guys, thanks for tuning in to another video on ForgottenWeapons.com. I'm Ian McCollum and I am here today at Denel Land Systems and we are taking a look at their NTW-20, which is really a pretty interesting 20mm anti-material rifle. It's chambered for the 20x82 cartridge instead of some of the larger and more common, well, or used to be more common, 20mm rounds like the US 20x102 Vulcan, the 20x110s, or for comparison's sake, if you get up to things like the old World War II Lotties and Solitherns, those were 20x138. So this is a substantially shorter cartridge, and that's done deliberately because this is not intended to be an anti-tank rifle. The days of a rifle like this being a feasible weapon against an actual tank are long, long gone. This is instead intended to be, well, an anti-material rifle, and in particular, it's intended to be a man-portable anti-material rifle. So we'll get into disassembly in a moment, but the barrel comes out very easily without any tools other than a cartridge or an empty case. And this whole thing splits into 2 packages that are about 15 kilos each, so about 30 pounds each. And for a 2-man team, that's heavy, but that's far from impractical. And so the idea is this allows a small team to get into some place that might be inaccessible to larger forces or larger weaponry, but actually have basically cannon firepower at their disposal. So if you look at the cartridge, of course it is a little shorter. Muzzle velocity is a little lower than something like a 20x138. However, the whole purpose of a 20mm projectile is the explosive effect of the warhead. And that's not velocity dependent at all. So having a lower muzzle velocity really doesn't degrade the functionality of something like this. And it allows for engagement of things like light vehicles, radar stations, heavy equipment, that sort of thing. And one of the other really cool features here is that because the barrel comes off very easily, and because this cartridge was specifically designed on the case head of the Russian 14.5mm cartridge, this actually comes with, as a standard package, 2 barrels, the 20x82 and also a 14.5 by, I believe it's 115 or 114. And the 2 cartridges do very different things, even though they're roughly the same physical size. The 20mm is something that's used for its high explosive payload. The 14.5 is a really high velocity cartridge. That thing's moving at something like 3,500 feet per second. That'd be like 1,150 meters per second, if I'm running the numbers right. It's an extremely fast cartridge, and that makes it actually really good at armor penetration. So something like this with the 14.5 barrel is an excellent weapon for engaging things like armored personnel carriers. It's not going to shoot through a tank, but something like a BMP or the equivalent is extremely vulnerable to a rifle like this, which can be carried around in a pair of backpacks by 2 guys pretty easily. So this isn't really intended to be a mass issue weapon. It's more of a niche weapon, and they have been in production since the mid-1990s when they were first developed, and they've actually been purchased by a number of militaries in small numbers. So these things are actually out there being used, and there's a lot of cool mechanical elements to this. So let's take a look at that next. All right, so let's start off with the magazine. It uses a 3-round detachable box magazine, and one of the issues you're going to run into with something that has this sort of recoil is the cartridges moving in the magazine. So you can see it has a fairly, for a follower, this is a very complex follower, to ensure that the cartridges are held nice and steady. And then, more substantially, here at the back, there is actually like a T-slot at the back of the magazine. And when you put a cartridge in, when you drop this down to put a second cartridge in, the rim is actually held firmly in place by these two little ridges in the magazine. And that prevents the number 2 and 3 cartridges in the mag from sliding around under recoil or getting pushed out of orientation. So there's the magazine fully loaded. Then the action itself is a manual bolt action. So bolt goes forward, drops down. There's a little locking wedge, or a little locking surface right there. So once the bolt's down, you can't accidentally bump it out of battery without pulling it just slightly back. Then, bolt opens, slides all the way back, ejects the cartridge, loads a new one. That's pretty basic and simple. One potential issue you run into with a cartridge like this, not so much the 20mm, but much more so the 14.5, is difficult extraction. So there's a specific primary extraction mechanism built into the gun. So right here is the opposite side of the bolt handle itself. And when you go to open the gun, the bolt handle actually slides. Well, I have to actually hold the bolt in place to do this. The handle itself is on a spring and it pivots. And this bar pushes against this surface right here, and that gives you primary extraction. That gives you like an 8-to-1 leverage advantage in prying the case out of the chamber first and then cycling the whole thing open. The scope is also a pretty unique thing to this rifle, and you may have noticed that the scope's really far forward on the gun. Now, if you're shooting a 20mm like this, one of the big concerns is, of course, the scope is going to come back and it's going to go straight through your face, and that's a problem. So what Denel did on this was they actually contracted out a custom, specifically made scope for this gun, and it is an 8-power by 56mm long eye relief scope. So you have absolutely no concern about this thing hitting you because, as you can see when I'm shooting it, your face is over a foot farther back behind the scope. Now, that's an absolute benefit. That's a really cool system to have. There are downsides to it. Primarily, the eye box is fairly small, so you do have to have your eye just in the right place in order to get a sight picture through the scope. That's an issue in general with long eye relief scopes. So as with so many things, it is a trade-off, but it's a cool trade-off to see done on this gun because the advantage, I think, is really well worth it. For example, when I did some shooting with a Solothurn, I was really kind of concerned about trying to use the scope because it was a traditional scope and you had to stick your face right up on it. Now, historically, you would have done that without wearing eye protection and using this rubber eye cup on the scope. But of course, today, we prefer to have eye protection, certainly if we're, if you're not actually out in the military where there's a real problem with it. So the combination of eye protection and rubber eye cups is a problem. This works really well. Now, the scope is also detachable. So we have 2 little thumb attachments here. Loosen those up, and the scope comes off as a unit. When you convert this from 20 to 14.5, you do have to change the scope because we have a BDC built into the scope base. So right here, you have your primary elevation adjustment, the BDC, and it's going to go from 150 meters all the way out to, crank it around there, all the way out to 1500. Because this is, it's a 20mm, it's going to have a fair amount of drop. This is a way that you can just easily dial in the range, and then you still have the actual scope adjustments to fine-tune it, to fine-tune your zero, and of course to compensate for wind or anything else that you want to fine adjust there. But this isn't a system like a commercial sporting rifle where you would be tinkering with exact powder charges and velocities. This is a system based on a very standardized military loading of a cartridge where the velocity is always going to be the same. So you can build a mechanical BDC like this, and it can actually be very useful. Right down here, this nut allows you to adjust the elevation of the scope base independent of the dial. So this is how it's actually zeroed at the factory, and can be re-zeroed if it needs to be. But not something you would typically use in the field. And then the attachment point up here is cut in such a way that this clamps on, so the force on this section is parallel between, it's exerted equally between these two screws so that it does return to zero when you take it off like this, and there's no chance of it being twisted to one side or the other because you're not just clamping at the front, you're actually clamping at the front and the back. You may have noticed this big, interesting, and rather distinctive handle. This does a couple of things. For one thing, it's like a roll bar crash guard around the scope to help protect it. You can pivot it forward to take the scope off. And then when you take the barrel out, this drops all the way down, and it actually gives you a handle to more easily carry the receiver section of the gun. Kind of cool. Now, normally I don't get into triggers all that much, but there's actually a lot of cool stuff going on in the trigger unit for this gun. So we're going to go ahead and take it off and show you. And that's pretty easily done. We have a thumb screw here. It's got a little slot in it so you can tighten it with pretty much anything, like a knife. And once you take it out, it just locks in the back. So unscrew it and the whole thing drops out. With the trigger mechanism out, you can see that it's actually a pretty simple system here. And it's one of those really elegant in its simplicity sorts of systems. So you have a hammer, of course. There's only one spring in the unit, and it's the torsion spring here on the hammer, which also drops over this pin and thus puts spring tension on the sear here as well. And you then have it's actually a two-stage trigger pull. Let's see if I can get the light on this well. So there is a nub right here, and then there's an adjustable screw right here. The nub provides the first stage. This screw determines the length and the break, basically, of the second stage of the trigger. So I'm gonna pull that down. It gives you, because it has a two-stage trigger, that means you've got plenty of engagement surface on the hammer, so there's no chance of, of an accidental discharge, which is something that can happen if you try to get a really light single-stage trigger. So that's an important safety element. Once you've basically gone through the first stage, then you have a nice, actually a remarkably light and crisp trigger pull for the second stage, releases the hammer, and then as long as you're holding on to the trigger, your hand is actually providing the spring tension that counteracts this to re-engage the hammer. As long as I'm holding the trigger here, it's going to hook on the front, and then when I release it, it snaps to the back. That's a pretty standard, that system is, well, obviously inspired by the M1 Garand, which was in turn inspired by the French RSC rifles. The safety here is equally simple. When you snap this back, it comes underneath this little tail right there and simply prevents the trigger from doing anything. So a really cool, clever system, all done with just a single spring and easily removable like this for any sort of maintenance that might need to be done. One last little feature on there is that the trigger guard actually pivots out of the way. So if you're using this in a cold climate, you can pull this just slightly out and it rotates around. And there's a second little hole right in there that it snaps into. And now the trigger is unobstructed, so you can fire it with heavy gloves or mittens. So disassembly of the rest is pretty simple. We're going to take this cheek cover and butt plate off, and you do that by depressing the two little spring-loaded detents here. There's one on the other side that you can't see. And then you actually use the bolt handle to give it a nice tap off the back. The bolt stop is actually built into this cheek rest. So once that's off, the bolt just slides right out the back. Inside the bolt, so the bolt has to be fairly long because of the overall length of the cartridge, and of course you want the bolt to remain in the receiver so it's nicely controlled and and doesn't get sloppy. However, there's actually a cutout right in the middle of the bolt for the hammer to swing. You've got a spring-loaded firing pin right there, 6 locking lugs on the front, extractor on the bottom, plunger ejector on the top, or I guess the extractor is actually on the right, the plunger ejector is on the left. And then we have a plate here. This ensures that if the bolt isn't fully in battery, the hammer will hit this and not be able to hit the firing pin. So once it's fully locked, then the firing pin can be struck. This particular rifle we're shooting today is one of the very early ones. On the current production guns, this plate is an integral machined part of the bolt. And then you saw when I talked about earlier the primary extraction, that's it right there. The bolt handle is actually spring-loaded and has that lever arm on its opposite side. Underneath that rear cover, back here, we have a big spring-loaded buffer assembly. The whole action, the barreled action, recoils in the stock to help absorb, well, recoil. We have a rear monopod down here, which, you know, there are a lot of little clever details built into the pieces of this, and this is one of them. So it's not uncommon to have a rear monopod that has a coarse through screw thread on it so that you can adjust your elevation. This one in particular can be set to either a 45-degree angle, or I can pop that out and set it at a 90-degree angle. And then this, the ball that actually touches the ground is also on a set of ball bearings. So this remains steady, doesn't move, when I screw the rear monopod up and down. What this means is that you can hold this nice and firm in position and adjust your elevation without causing the gun to walk slightly side to side, which means it's a lot easier to fine-tune your use of the monopod while you're actually trying to hold on a target and make a shot. So in order to remove the barrel, what we have to do is first loosen this locking collar, and that can be done with either a 20mm case or a 14.5. That slides right in there. Just pop that. You'll see there are two 14.5 sections and two 20mm sections. So whichever barrel you're using, the ammunition you have on hand can be used to do that. We just loosen that, and then the barrel is going to come out. So once we've got this loosened, this doesn't actually physically hold the barrel in. The barrel has locking lugs. This tightens down basically to lock the barrel in so you get best accuracy. To remove it, once we've got that loosened, we push in this little spring detent. Then I can rotate the barrel and slide it out. So there are the barrel's locking lugs. And then mechanically, the way the rest of this works is basically you have a stainless steel center trunnion into which the barrel locks from the front and the bolt locks from the rear. So this the receiver here is locked onto that trunnion by means of this nut. It's left-hand threaded on one side, right on the other. As you tighten this down, it locks the two pieces together, pulls them together. So the bolt does not actually lock into the barrel. The bolt locks into this intermediary trunnion, which the barrel also locks into in the front. Then at the front end, we have this protrusion here. This is a hydraulic dampener, which helps to counterbalance the impact of the whole assembly coming forward after it's recoiled rearward. It's interesting to point out that the reason that it's got this kind of bulge in it is that there's actually a little valve in there to allow expansion and contraction as temperature changes, because you're actually talking about a movement of something like 6 millimeters between typical hot desert and typical cold Arctic conditions, just based on the density or the volume of the oil in here. So more complexity to that system than you might expect. In total, what makes this an actually really remarkably comfortable shooting gun, despite being relatively light and despite being a big 20mm cartridge, is a combination of the recoil spring in the stock, the hydraulic dampener in the front, and this really big and effective muzzle brake on the end of the barrel. There is a little bit more disassembly we can do, and that is to pull the actual receiver out of the chassis. So the way this works, it actually starts back here. There is a cross pin right there that mounts, that holds the recoil spring in place. So we're going to push that out. That is a captive pin. So that goes through to there. Once this is disconnected and the recoil spring is loose, then we can push the whole receiver about an inch forward, which allows us to then remove 2 pins that lock the receiver into the recoil spring and the hydraulic dampener. Those pins are located in this hole, and for the sake of brevity, I've already taken them out. By the way, this is an early rifle, and originally the safety was up here. That's been moved onto the trigger group, but that's why you have this additional hole in the action. Now, with those pins removed, we can take out the spring buffer, and then this whole assembly slides back and lifts out. So you've got 2 lugs on this right here. This one is connected with a through pin, one of these guys, to the hydraulic dampener in the front. This one is connected to the recoil buffer right here in the back. There is a slot right here for the hammer to travel through. And one thing I didn't mention earlier that's kind of cool here is because this whole receiver recoils backward when you fire, this actually recocks the hammer. So you're not fighting the hammer when you operate the bolt, which leads to it having a particularly nice, smooth, and easy bolt stroke. Because you've got the hammer coming through, the hammer's fixed to the frame, this recocks it when it cycles. And then up here is this is really the heart of the gun. This is the main locking piece that connects the bolt in the back to the barrel in the front. So one of the cool things about this is while the cartridge is its own proprietary case, 20 by 82, the projectiles are actually very standard 20 millimeter projectiles. So what that means is there's a wide variety of ammunition that has long ago been developed for this because the projectiles are all around. It's relatively inexpensive from a military perspective, and that just really helps make it an easy weapon system for a lot of small militaries to get into. So we have an assortment here. Practice round. We have, this guy is armor piercing. If you really want armor piercing, probably the better option is the 14.5 Soviet cartridge. This is totally standard 14.5 AP. They do also make tracer and incendiary, and they even make a high explosive version of the 14.5. But of course, because it's a smaller projectile, it has a lot less space, and it's not a very effective 14.5. So if you want HE, the way to go is 20 millimeter. If you want AP, the way to go is 14.5. And then in here we have high explosive tracer. We have plain high explosive. These are all dummy cartridges. And we have semi armor piercing high explosive. So kind of a compromise combination round. Well, that certainly went a little bit longer than I was expecting for just a bolt-action rifle. There's actually a lot of really cool stuff going on in this thing. So I guess the one thing I didn't really quite touch on is the interchangeability. This is available, like I said, both in 20 by 82 and 14.5 Soviet. And to interchange between those, it's a swapping of the barrel, the bolt, and the scope. Because of course the BDC is built into the scope base, and the BDC is going to be different for those 2 different cartridges. In addition, a while back, there was actually a request for this rifle in a more standardized cartridge, the 20 by 110, which apparently one particular government thought would be easier to source. It isn't really, but that's a substantially longer cartridge, and it's a substantially more powerful cartridge. And so you can also interchange a 20 by 110 barrel and scope and bolt into this. However, the cartridge is long enough that it's not magazine fed. So they make this both as this unit with a magazine box on it here. If you use it in 20 by 110, it's a single shot rifle. You just drop a cartridge into the chamber when you want to fire. And they also offer, Denel has a dedicated 20 by 110 version of the gun, which doesn't have that cutout for the magazine box. Because of course, if that's all you're going to be shooting it in, there's no reason to have a big open hole on the side of the action. So they offer it both ways. But it's really cool that it's that convertible. You saw the process for removing the bolt, for removing the barrel. It's pretty quick. Now, nobody's going to actually carry this in the field with 2 different barrels and 2 different types of ammunition. That's an administrative sort of change, but it's a very simple and easy administrative change. So really a pretty cool system. I think we're going to go do a little bit more shooting now, or at least show you some high speed if we haven't already. But I would very much like to thank Denel Land Systems for giving me the opportunity to take a look at this cool thing, shoot a bunch of ammo through it, and bring it to you guys. If If you enjoyed this, stay tuned for more cool Forgotten Weapons. Thanks for watching. All right, let's fire a few more rounds here. Good. So I know I look like a total dork shooting with these sunglasses inside, but these are actually ballistic sunglasses, and I did not think to bring clear shooting glasses.